Good morning, everybody. I'm Carl Skooglund. Good to see all of you all. Welcome to Treasure Hunt, in which we explore the earliest Buddhist teachings known as the suttas and as compiled in the Pali Canon. Today, we wrap up our study of the well-known Satipatthana Sutta, Foundations of Mindfulness discourse, which concludes with a section on the Four Noble Truths. Overall, just by way of review of the Satipatthana framework, this teaching has us contemplate four themes. The themes of the body, the theme of feelings, of pleasure and pain, the theme of the mind, and dhammas, or teachings. And in addition to recalling and remembering these things, bringing them to mind, the teaching also has us remain ardent. That is, we maintain a healthy intention that our efforts will be a good use of our time, a good use of our mind, you might say. We're also encouraged with this teaching to remain aware. That is, we clearly comprehend what it is that we've brought to mind, that we've made ourselves mindful of. And then third, we let go of our agendas for the world around us just for a period of time, just for the period of practice, and devote the time to practice. Now, mindfulness in the early tradition, as you've heard me say, is not to be generically aware. Instead, it's to bring something into particular to mind and then to consider it deeply. And as a result, over time, we start to gradually understand why things happen the way that they do. And in particular, why we suffer and how we can be free. With this last section of the teaching, we bring to mind the theme, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And in the February class, the last class, we focused on the first of the Four Noble Truths, which is the noble truth of dukkha, which is that wide swath of experience that runs from outright suffering on the one hand to the subtlest forms of imbalance on the other. And here's some of the main things from our last class that I want to repeat and I think are worth remembering. The first is that the Buddha rediscovered, it is said, rediscovered the Four Noble Truths on the night of his awakening 2,500 years ago. And that they were the first thing that he taught, as was recorded in a sutta called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. I don't know what it is. For some reason, I like how that sounds. I just like saying the name of that sutta, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And it gets translated as setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. So in this teaching, the Buddha outlined the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path leading to the end of dukkha. What he also did with this teaching, which gets a little less airtime, is that he outlined tasks that were associated with each of the four truths. And that is that we're to comprehend dukkha, the first noble truth. We're to abandon the cause of dukkha, which is craving, the second noble truth. And we're to realize the end of dukkha, the third noble truth. And then finally, we're to develop the path, the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth noble truth. The message here is that we don't just hold these truths up in our minds and consider them in the abstract, right? Instead, we take action in regard to each of the truths. We comprehend, we abandon, we realize, and we develop. Again, in the last class, we focused on the first noble truth, and in this long version of the Satipatthana that we're using as the basis of our study, there's a long list of what qualifies as dukkha, the first noble truth. In it, the Buddha starts us off with the things in life that are pretty clearly difficult: birth, aging, and death. After that, he spells out the great variety of physical pain and mental heartache, which the Pali terms for those things get translated as sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. The next thing that he outlines as dukkha is association with the unbeloved. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Stress being Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of dukkha. So this points to unpleasant, painful sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical touches, and then also painful thoughts and emotions. He also includes with this category of unbeloved, being around people that we find to be challenging, right? And so with this, he's pointing out how painful, how distressing our social relations can be. This is part of dukkha. And on the flip side, separation from the loved is stressful, is dukkha. That is, not being able to be around or have access to pleasant, pleasing sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, and not being able to have pleasant thoughts and emotions. And he also includes in separation from the loved, not being able to be around people who care for us, people we feel comfortable around. The next thing that he lists is not getting what is wanted. He says that is stressful. In that, we may want to be free of all these kinds of pain, all these kinds of heartache, but as the text says, this is not to be achieved by wishing. The painful truth, even on the positive side, we actively want, what is good for the world. We seek that out. But again, this is not to be achieved by wishing. The section on the First Noble Truth ends by saying, the 5 aggregates of clinging are stressful. That's a technical term, the 5 aggregates, and it is a shorthand reference to this compilation of what makes us human, you might say. Body, feelings of pleasure and pain, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, intentions, and then finally consciousness. So overall, the tradition points to how we take up these things and we perceive them to be us. We perceive them to be who we are. But the tradition also has us view them instead as being, cobbled together bundles, heaps of stuff. These are other translations of aggregate. It has us consider that these aggregates are impermanent, empty, and void without any enduring substance. Now, in terms of dukkha, these aggregates are dukkha not because they're outright painful necessarily, although they can be. Instead, it's because they're unreliable. They're not capable of providing lasting satisfaction. And then just to add, dukkha isn't just about pain. It also points to the fact that, even all the good things that we want, all the things that we want and we really got, somehow we actually got them. Even when that happens, dukkha comes from points to the fact that even those things we got and we wanted, they can't permanently satisfy. They don't tend to. We get tired of them. We move on to something else. In one text from the Samyutta Nikaya, it says that the typical results of dukkha are that we become obsessed, we become confused. we fight back, and, in our own experience, our bodies tense up, our minds race. The text also says that we seek answers in the outer world. We look outside of ourselves for answers. Who can solve this pain of ours? So what the tradition does is has us make a real paradigm shift. And that is that we look inward instead of looking outward. Part of that is that we turn toward what's difficult. We turn toward that which we might typically avoid. But the ironic thing, the paradoxical thing, is that in doing so, we can come into a kind of relief that comes from just looking squarely at something, rather than the tension that comes about when we kind of want to turn our heads away. Now, this takes practice and it takes courage, but when we find that we can be with the hard stuff, when we start to establish a firm footing within that, in the midst of difficulty, it helps us with the clarity. It helps us come into the clarity that we need in order to take the next steps along the path, which takes us to the second noble truth. So this is the first, new portion of the class for today. In Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of the second noble truth, it says, and what is the noble truth of the origination of stress, or the cause of stress? It is the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by delight and passion, relishing now here and now there. That is sensuality craving, becoming craving, and non-becoming craving. Now, all that's quite a mouthful, I understand, but another way of translating this might be, and what is the noble truth of the cause of dukkha? It is the craving that makes for further being, for further existence, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing here and there, this and that, craving for sense pleasure, craving for existence, and craving for non-existence. So there were, just take note, there were three types there at the end: sense pleasure, existence, and non-existence. So we make, I think, what is a really interesting transition in going from the first noble truth to the second noble truth. In the first noble truth, the noble truth of dukkha, it's mostly a description of what we find to be difficult. Birth, aging, and death, getting what is painful, not getting what is pleasurable. And then finally, the unreliability and balance of this, impermanent, concocted bundles of existence, the five aggregates. But as we'll see as we go through the list of the second noble truth shortly, it's mostly a description of how we seek pleasure. It's a description of various kinds of craving. Tanha is the Pali word, and thirst is the literal translation of the word tanha, which gets translated as craving. Now, maybe it's just the way my mind works, but when I first looked at this kind of closely, it seemed to me like the first noble truth is talking about one thing, varieties of difficulty, but the second noble truth is talking about a second thing, varieties of pleasure, and how we crave them. We can dive into the details kind of at the end if that's interesting to you at all, but for now I just want to say that the way I've come to frame this for myself, this isn't gospel, but the way I frame it is that the first noble truth lays out the things that are in this conditioned realm. It's dukkha. And the second noble truth lays out how we try to cobble together and lay claim to pleasure and satisfaction in the midst of that dukkha. Right? The first noble truth is how things are hard. And the second noble truth is how we try to carve out and maintain pleasure and satisfaction within the overall backdrop of dukkha. Something to, ponder, as the text says, contemplate, feel your way into in your own practice, But let's get back to the text and break it down. It says, I'm just going to repeat what was said at first. What is the noble truth of the cause of dukkha? It is the craving that makes for further becoming, for further being, for further existence. Tanisawa Bhikkhu translates this as craving for becoming. Becoming is his translation of the Pali word bhava, B-H-A-V-A. Other translations are being and existence. Okay, so what does all this mean? Strictly speaking, this refers to how life craves life, you might say. And in the Buddhist cosmology, the ancient cosmology, you're probably aware that this craving is what leads beings to be reborn again and again. And you might say reborn again and again and again and again. Right? And to the early Buddhists, this wasn't something that was celebrated. They didn't find this to be enlivening. Their perception of it is that it was exhausting. Right? And on a more fine grain level, this also refers to how when we crave and cling to something, we create and inhabit particular spheres of being, you might say, right? In which we take on certain cloaks of identity, right? We become particular beings, as parents, children, siblings, spouses, partners. We create identities, affiliations, or, around race, ethnicity, gender. It's all the ways in which we want to define ourselves, in our own minds and also in the minds of others. And so you could say that in this way, we are also reborn. We are reborn again and again. And over life, again and again and again and again. We were born again into certain kinds of existence. And you may have felt at times, that it is exhausting. This creating and recreating ourselves. This compulsion. It's not always strong, but sometimes it can feel incessant, So it's exhausting, and yet there is something compelling about it. As the text says, this craving for further existence is accompanied by passion and delight. So it's pointing to how we do get these hits of pleasure. The weekend finally gets here, we have a nice meal, we watch a movie, someone gives us a compliment. The text goes on to say that we relish this passion and delight here and there, in this, and then in that. It's pointing to how we jump from, thing to thing, from this experience to that object. In one simile, the Buddha compares this to how monkeys swing from branch to branch up in the canopy of a forest. Compares it to how we grasp after one thing, let go of it, and then go on to grasp another thing. Next, the text outlines three particular kinds of pleasure, that we crave. First, it says we crave for sense pleasure. Sense pleasure is that umbrella term for what the tradition sometimes calls worldly pleasure. It's, what comes to us or what we seek or what we create within these particular senses that we happen to have been equipped with, right? Eye, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And so there are those 6 senses, and I find it interesting to just consider that the mind itself, under this scenario, is just another kind of sense organ, in that the mind can become conscious of a particular kind of stimulus. The stimulus being, thoughts and emotions. Now, as a society, I don't want to say, that we're entirely hedonistic, but a good portion, I think it's fair to say, a good portion of how we're encouraged to make ourselves happy is based on these, kind of highly commercialized packets of pleasure, fragments of pleasure. There's a fairly constant barrage as you move around in the world. And a lot of it can be harmless. It's not terribly bad, but it is sort of the environment that we tend to swim in. So in that way, I think it's still a good idea to reflect every now and then and to ask ourselves, how do I tend to make myself happy? What's my tendency? What do I tend to rely on to make myself happy? And as we reflect on this, it's good to keep in mind that unworldly, or what are sometimes called spiritual pleasure, is actually part of the path. It's actually part of the raft, that is the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's not that we're supposed to deny ourselves pleasure. It's just that as part of being on the path, we start to look for it in different ways, create it in healthier ways. The second of the 3 kinds of craving is craving for existence. Now, this is an especially tricky one. This one, again, describes how we crave life itself. And we crave not just life, but, it's also those hits of experience that make us feel alive. We're drawn to peak experiences, right? And just to say plainly, this really goes against the grain, not just of our society, but of all of human conditioning, in that life wants to be alive. So when we encounter this part of the teaching, we naturally ask, what's the deal? Are we not supposed to want to be alive? Is wanting to be alive, is that bad? I think, as best as I can feel my way into that reflection, the way I answer it for myself is that the Buddha is having us ask a radical question. And that question is, does this life in this conditioned realm, actually, what does it actually get us? Is this the best we can do? And the Buddha's answer is yes, there is something better than that. He's pointing to Nibbana. The third of the 3 kinds of craving is craving for non-existence. And this points to how we do experience moments of exhaustion. We just want something to be gone. All right. So instead of wanting something to come to us, we want something to go away. So we have these 3 kinds of craving, and the next section of the text says, And where does this craving arise? Where does it dwell? It arises and dwells in whatever is endearing and alluring in terms of the world. And what is endearing and alluring? It's at this point in the text that the Buddha spells out 10 kinds of things, which I'll summarize. First, he says that we have these sense organs, these 6 sense organs, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And then he says that there are 6 kinds of objects: visual forms, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and then thoughts and emotions. Interestingly, there are also 6 different kinds of consciousness that go with each sense. And when these 3 things come together, it's a matrix of 3 by 6. When they come together, we have what is called contact. And it's at that point where we have raw experience. So based on these kinds of raw sensory contact, at each of the 6 senses, hang in there with me, we then have feelings and perceptions, right? That is, we feel pleasure and pain relative to what we've come into contact with. And then we apply labels to what we've come into contact with. After contact, feelings, and perceptions, he lists intentions. That is, intentions based on our feelings and perceptions. Based on those things, we form impulses. It's the volitional activities. And one of the first impulses is to, here we go, crave. Right? And then the last 2 things on this list of 10 are directed thought and evaluation. These last 2 terms, the Pali words for which are vitakka and vichara, and they refer to how we start thinking about stuff. Right? So from start to finish, we have experiences within the 6 sense spheres. They feel certain ways, and we apply certain labels to those experiences. Certain impulses arise, we crave, and then the mind gets triggered. We get enchanted or irritated, and then we think on and on about it. Okay. And all of this, the Buddha says, is the noble truth of the origination of dukkha. That's where he ends. So just to back up a bit, I totally get it if you find all of this to be confusing and frustrating. Welcome to life, you might say, within the Pali Canon. But, if we start to understand the conditions that surround craving in particular, we have a better chance of cluing into it, unraveling it, of becoming disenchanted with what we've become enchanted with. We can have moments like that one in the movie The Matrix. It's that moment, if you're familiar with that movie, it's that moment in which the main character, Neo, he saw what experience within the Matrix was composed of, and it was discomposed of little fragments, little flashes of energy. And, when he saw that, the Matrix lost control over him. If you haven't seen the movie, I think it's actually a Dharma movie. Might be worth checking out. So if the second noble truth is the tightening of our hand around something, then moving on to the third noble truth, you could say that the third noble truth is the relaxation of our hand. It's the relaxation of that craving. The text says, and what is the noble truth of the cessation of stress, of dukkha? It is the remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. So as famous as Buddhism is for emphasizing dukkha, the reason that the Buddha left his home, the reason he left his family, was to find the end of dukkha, which is the third noble truth. And it is the reason that the Buddha taught. Right? So if you think about it, if there was no third noble truth, there would be no Buddhism. Looking back in my own life, I think that I had my first experience with the third noble truth one morning when I was walking to school as a child with some friends. I think we were all in about 7th grade. And it was really cold outside, cold for Dallas at least. And we were all, complaining about the cold to each other and getting really dramatic about it, you might say. Well, one of us, a kid named Jeff Dover, we were walking along doing this complaining, and he said, you can be cold and suffer, or you can just be cold. And, I'd never heard anything like that in my life. And what he did for me in that moment was to separate the fragment pain from the fragment suffering. Whereas before that, pain and suffering, I perceived to be the same thing. I labeled them as being inseparable. So in general, when we're awake to when we let go of something, when we're really there for it, you might say, it can open up a sense of possibility. Especially when it's something that we didn't think we could let go of. We have that sense of being relieved of something. I didn't think I could be relieved of that, but now I am. Wow. And then maybe it happens with something else, at another time in regard to something else, And if that becomes our practice, then over time, we can become, or it can give us a sense of confidence, a sense of trust. And then, even if we're really stuck on something, bound up really tightly, even if we can't shake the dukkha in that moment, there's still a part of us that knows that it is possible for us to shake it. If we just keep at it and be patient. It's like, the fever hasn't broken yet, but we know we have the right medicine, and it's just a matter of time. If you might call this the Buddhist form of faith. And let me, and that is that nibbana, awakening. It may seem like a mythological state, but I ask you to stay open to the possibility that with sincere practice, that you can get a taste of the awakened mind. It's not impossible. It's not a fairy tale. It's not just an incremental improvement of something that we already know. Instead, it's a completely different way for a human mind to be. I've been talking for a while. Once again, I get it. These texts are highly technical, and we might reasonably ask, where's the felt sense of it? Where's the heart element? And as I said in the last class, the Four Noble Truths, they are complex. But in my experience, in my own practice, I found that they can be very streamlined. And what I'd like to do now is give ourselves a little bit of a practice opportunity. So if you want to, if you'd like, rearrange your posture to sit for a while, and we can see how this might work. How we can apply the Four Noble Truths to a contemplative experience. So yes, setting your posture. Perhaps let your eyes close or your gaze fall downward. And then start by breathing in, breathing out, quite consciously, quite deliberately. Breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax your body. Breathe in, feel your body. Breathe out and relax. Bring the mind into the body. Make yourself aware of the sensations that let you know that you have a body, the sensations that let you know that you are breathing. And then whatever sensations of body and breathing you notice, see if they can be relaxed. Once the mind is settled a little bit, not completely, but just enough that the attention feels stable, we can ask ourselves this question. We can bring to mind the First Noble Truth and ask ourselves, what dukkha might there be in this moment? What form of dissatisfaction or imbalance might there be in this moment? It might be something obvious, or it might be something very subtle. Where in this moment might there be imbalance? How might the mind be compelled by something, pushed along, pulled along? Again, it might be in this moment some form of heartache or just a subtle whisper of some form of imbalance. Know it. Know that it's there. Feel your way into this. Discover for yourself, where is there tension? Where is there tightness of any kind, in mind or body? It may not feel like something as strong as craving. It may just feel like whispers of just wanting something to be different. Feel your way into that energy of wanting, no matter how subtle it may be, in regard to whatever it is that's being wanted. And now seeing for yourself, can that tension, can that imbalance be released? Whatever's creating imbalance, can it be released? Whatever tension, whatever subtle grasping you might encounter, breathe into it. See if it can relax. See if it cannot bother you. Even if there are forms of tension that can't be released right now, see if at least there can be a part of the mind that is relaxed, that is released, even in the midst of that tension. Is that possible right now? Breathe in, feel the body. Breathe in, feel the mind. Breathe out, relax. So whether that kind of reflection resonated or not, I encourage you to come up with your own ways to work the basics of the Four Noble Truths into your practice. Use your own language. Do it in your own ways. That's where it's going to make the most difference, I think. Shed the most light on what we're talking about here. For now, we've got a few more things to finish up here in the Satipatthana, namely the fourth noble truth, which is the path leading to the end of dukkha, the eightfold path. And here's what the text says. And what is the noble truth of the path of practice leading to the cessation of stress, to the cessation of dukkha? Just this very noble eightfold path. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So interestingly, perhaps surprisingly, hopefully not disappointingly, I'm not actually going to do a deep dive into the Eightfold Path. That could take probably another year, right? So I'm actually going to set it to the side. If one reason is that there are just so many resources out there, so many other good resources on what the Eightfold Path is that, I think you'd be well served to look at those as well. But what I would like to do instead, starting with our next class actually, is review a teaching also out of the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses. It's the second course of that collection, and it's called The Fruits of the Homeless Life. And what I think is going to be interesting about that one is that it lays out for us what you might call another version of the path, another way of being on this path of practice, one that may not be familiar to most of us, but I think will be really interesting and more important, helpful to your practice. So that'll be for next time. What I want to do to end today and to end, our exploration of the Satipatthana is just recap a few of the major points. So to say, that the teaching starts us off, with one of the most basic things that any practitioner can do, and that is to breathe in and breathe out. Right, that's the very first thing that it does, as part of the theme of the body. It has us go on, after we breathe in and breathe out, to proactively keep the mind immersed in the body and relax the body. The further parts of the under the theme of the body, it also asks us to perceive these bodies in ways that encourage disenchantment, which might sound bad, but really it's just it encourages us to not be enchanted with these, cobbled together fabrications, to not be strung along with attachment to this body. Something that becomes more important as we become older. The second satipatthana, has us consider the role of pleasure and pain. Keep the role of pleasure and pain in mind. And they have a crucial role in that they are the fundamental basis of so much of what we think and say and do. Pleasure and pain being just a primary motivating force. But, as part of this practice, we become clearly aware of how they motivate us. And, even just that little bit of insight, can be, one of our first footholds into freedom, you might say. With the third satipatthana, we bring to mind the mind itself, its range of states, and what goes into us creating particular mind states, creating the mind states that we do. And the teaching also has us to be clear about the mind states, clear when they're happening rather than be caught within them. Be aware of them rather than be induced into, being enchanted, mesmerized, enthralled. And the fourth satipatthana is a range of fundamental dhammas, fundamental teachings, these 5 of them. And just to point out, the woven into each of them is the encouragement to let go of what causes harm and to develop what helps us. There's language in each one of those that encourages us basically to be skillful. And as I've said on occasion, as we work with this teaching, we have a chance to see past our fundamental attachments, past our fundamental points of confusion. We have a chance to see why we suffer and how we can be free. First here, first there, with this, and then with that. And as the refrain reminded us again and again, I didn't actually emphasize it as much, looking back, didn't emphasize it as much as may have been appropriate. But, please don't forget the refrain. It gets repeated at least 13 times, at the end of which it says, it points to the fruit of the practice. That fruit being, it says, we abide independent, not clinging to, not identified with anything in the world. And just the very last thing to say about this, when we do find ourselves stuck, find ourselves mired, struggling, or mesmerized, we might recall one particular verse from the Dhammapada that I really like. It's verse 91. It says, the mindful, they apply themselves. They don't amuse themselves in any abode. Like swans flying from a lake, they abandon home after home. The mindful apply themselves. They don't amuse themselves in any abode. Like swans flying from a lake, they abandon home after home. So with that, I'd like to end the class. I hope this has been helpful.